It really started with a feeling of being a little bit despondent about the state of the world, saying, what are we going to do about this crazy world? How could we possibly be helpful in bringing more sanity?
What's the deepest silence you've ever known? Today, the world is louder than ever, and it's not just the noise in our ears, but the noise in our screens and in our heads. So the question may be difficult to answer, yet it's a question that could contain the key to solving some of the most serious personal and even global challenges we face.
Hi, I'm Casey.
And I'm Andy, and we're on a mission to inspire and guide 1 million people to live a life of purpose, passion, and self-mastery, leveraging the 5 mountains of cutting-edge human development.
Today, we are speaking with authors Justin Talbot Zorn and Leigh Marz. Justin has served as both a strategist and meditation teacher in the U.S. Congress, a Harvard and Oxford trained specialist in the economics and psychology of human thriving. He's written for the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, Foreign Policy, and other publications. Justin lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his wife and 3 children. Leigh is a collaboration and leadership coach for major universities, corporations, and federal agencies, as well as a longtime student of pioneering researchers and practitioners of the ritualized use of psychedelic medicines in the West. She's led training programs to promote an experimental mindset among teams at NASA and a decade-long cross-sector collaboration to reduce toxic chemicals and products in partnership with Green Science Policy Institute, Harvard University, IKEA, Google, and Kaiser Permanente. Leigh lives in Berkeley, California with her husband and daughter. Welcome, Justin and Leigh.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. It's good to be here.
Thank you.
We're excited
We
to
are
have you.
excited. We'd like to start things off just seeing what's going on in your life today. So Leigh and Justin, what are you most excited about in your lives right now?
What a nice question. Well, I'm excited about the shift. We published our book a week ago. And so I'm excited about the shift from it being a project that Justin and I are holding dear to a collectively held project. And I really feel a difference in that energetically. And so there's a lot more lightness and space for other things in my life, like my family and dance and all the other things I enjoy. So gardening.
Nice.
Yeah.
I would say much the same, feeling excited to see people receiving this and hearing different perspectives on the book. And for me, it's a continual process of putting this into practice. I have 2-year-old twins at home and a 5-year-old, and we're actually traveling together at the moment. We're in San Diego, so navigating the noise and finding these moments of quiet attention.
Nice. And we're here talking about your book, your new book, Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. And this is just a topic that I think hits home for us and many of our listeners. So without further, we're going to jump right into some great conversation.
Just to start off, why did you two, as people that spent most of your careers working in climate, pollution, mental health, domestic violence, why did you decide to write a book about silence?
Mm-hmm.
It really started with a feeling of being a little bit despondent about the state of the world and saying, what are we going to do about this crazy world? How could we possibly be helpful in bringing more sanity? And in answering that question, we both, coming from the backgrounds that you described, were feeling a little bit at a loss for what to do and had an intuition that the answers might not come through more thinking or talking. There's a lot of data in the world. There's a lot of sound and mental stuff, and we could talk about the empirical evidence that all that is increasing. But we both had this intuition that maybe the answers are in silence. So we wrote an article about that for Harvard Business Review and took it from there. What else would you say, Leigh?
Just that when we did publish that article in our Harvard Business Review, we were surprised by the response. So the resonance with the readers made us step back and think about what's really wanting to be explored here. So we started having those conversations, interviews, following the cookie crumbs, and interviewing people like neuroscientists and activists and poets and executives and national politicians, a man incarcerated on death row, a Grammy-winning opera singer, a heavy metal frontman, naturally, a cowboy lumberjack, and an Air Force lieutenant colonel. And we asked them that question that you opened us with, Andy: what's the deepest silence you've ever known? And through their stories and insights, we've written a book that just looks at why silence matters so much in our personal and collective well-being, and how to find it in these noisy times.
Beautiful. This is, I think, a very powerful and timely release. I think we're experiencing right now just this crazy, like, people don't know where to go, where to turn, where to turn off even, or how to turn off all the noise that's coming from the left, from the right, from the middle. All the apps vying for our attention with the little, cursor, the little notifications popping up. Why do you see silence as the solution to the complex challenges that we face today?
Yeah, we talk in the book about the possibility of moving beyond the tedious push-pull of a point and counterpoint culture. Is it possible to find spaces where we could connect more deeply? So one element to it is that noise, this unwanted distraction, all that interferes with our clear perception and intention. This noise is stress in our bodies and our minds. And we could see that reflected in the social discourse, for example. So when we think about the power of silence, to find these social solutions, to find solutions to challenges we're facing in the world, we think about resting the mental reflex that is there to habitually protect a reputation and promote a point of view, to get to take a break from what we call one of life's most basic responsibilities of having to think of what to say. So is it possible to move into a space where we can listen more deeply, not just to other people, but listen to our own intuition?
Yeah, just say that when we do look at this, we're looking at that auditory noise and the impact that Justin was talking about on our physical well-being and stress in that way. That's connected to far more than what's happening in our ears. And loss of hearing is a serious thing, but it links to cardiovascular health and depression and anxiety and all sorts of things that our research has shown. And then looking at informational noise, and you hinted to that, Andy, just the things that are grabbing for our attention, which is really an unprecedented amount of things. And our attentional capacity, our ability to process that information, is not increasing, while the world of attention grabbing things and that whole economic system is increasing, like massively, we'll say, exponentially. And then what we were interested in is also how that noise is impacting our internal landscape, our thinking world, or how we live inside. And it turns out that is also the anxiety and the rumination, that kind of stress internally, is also on the rise. So we look at the research of Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan, and he estimates that we have something like 320 State of the Union addresses going through our brains every day, because compressed speech is far more condensed than our spoken speech. So this is a lot of noise that we're contending with. Yeah.
Looking from yesterday to today, is it really noisier than in other times in history? And what's so special about right now?
Yeah, it's an important question, because people have always complained about the noisiness of the world. We found some research from about 2,500 years ago about the noise of big cities in South Asia. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the deities grew so tired of humanity that they sent a great flood to wipe out, all of humanity, the world. But today, it's an empirical fact. The world is actually noisier than it's ever been. It's a kind of mass proliferation of mental stimulation, we say. And it's at the auditory level. We look at the research of how emergency vehicles have to be loud enough to break through the surrounding sound. So they're a really good proxy for how we're able to measure how loud it is in the world. And those emergency vehicles, like fire engines, are about 6 times louder than they were a century ago. So that's evidence that at least in urban areas, we're facing a real increase in auditory noise. And there's other measures of this. And it's also, though, and this is intuitive for most people, that there's obviously a huge rise of informational noise. Eric Schmidt, when he was the CEO of Google back in 2010, said that we're creating as much mental stuff, as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization up until 2003, every single day. So there is a genuinely exponential rise in informational noise. And what we've been studying is how this actually impacts what Leigh was just describing about how there's estimated 320 State of the Union addresses worth of internal chatter in the average human consciousness, at least in the United States, that all the auditory and informational noise leads to an increase of internal noise too. It's the feelings of being always on, for example.
When I think about energy and vitality, I think about a kid. They have the energy to play, run around, climb things. That energy that feels like you just can't contain yourself. It's the stuff we've always wished they could just bottle up and sell to us, right? Well, this company's found a way to do just that. Amari's Happy Juice Pack. Mood, motivation, energy, things our bodies can naturally produce when both our guts and our brains are happy and communicating. And we can actually improve that process of communication across the axis of the gut and the brain. This is cutting-edge science. This is game-changing information. This is where science meets soul. This is Amari, and we're helping people feel better naturally. Boost your serotonin and GABA. Balance your neurotransmitters. Nourish your gut. The things that make you want to do. Start feeling better the natural way. Check out the links in the show notes for discounts and more information.
Yeah, we find that one of the biggest challenges that our clients face is quieting the internal chatter, right? That noise, the monkey mind, the Buddhist expression. So I would love to come back a little bit later and just talk about some ways that maybe we can tap into that quiet, that silence there.
Absolutely.
And we're no strangers to this. How do you see the pandemic recently, how that's changed some of the noise of the world? And what has that made possible?
I think, we were, of course, in relationship, the pandemic, and then our book, we were in constantly looking at what was happening there. And it's really interesting. For some, our worlds got much quieter, right? We started noticing the birdsong outside of our homes. Apps around birding went through the roof, and all kinds of awareness. And there's even reported from scientists improvements in the whales mating and hearing one another, their songs, as the shipping industry slowed down. But those moments we're pretty much back to normal in terms of our auditory landscape. But there was an awareness that came, I think, online there in a great way for many people. And then for many others, life got much louder because our homes became doubled as offices and tripled as schoolhouses, perhaps. That was true for Justin and I. So regardless, I suppose, of that change, there was a massive change, across the population. So the awareness of sound and stimulus in our environment, those shifts and changes, it hit all of us at once in a big way, in one way or another. So I think that's a prime opportunity for awareness to come through. So we were happy about the perhaps openness of our readers to see this moment unique from others.
What came up for me when you were describing, the adventure through the pandemic, is everything. You note in your book that everything is in vibration, right? Even the things that seem rock solid. And we recently had a chance to spend about 6 weeks in Hawaii, kicking around the different islands. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I just thought it was an interesting point. they shut down some of the marine reserve areas like Kanama Bay, and they started doing studies, and they noticed that in these places that were heavily trafficked by tourists, that there had been a lot of damage to the coral reefs. Well, some of the coral reefs started coming back during this pause. So, like, again, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I just thought that was a really neat thing. Everything being in vibration, everything being in motion, but yet pausing on in a different aspect of that. We start to see some clarity and some rejuvenation.
I think that actually perfectly connects with this, because what ended up happening is unplanned. We had unplanned massive experiments for what's different, what's possible. You couldn't have closed down that beach. You couldn't have stopped that, that tourist flow for the money that we generate in that kind of economy. But we got to send out, in a sense, all these little learning probes for what happens if we change things up.
On the other side of that, though, can silence be a bad thing?
Absolutely. I mean, we talk in the book quite a bit about the notion of silence as apathy, as complacency, as complicity in the face of injustice, silence as violence in some cases. And we describe with respect this notion. But we look in the book about how so much of the apathy that's present in the modern world in the face of what's wrong, carelessness, isn't these days a function of people getting beyond the noise and people finding quiet time and quiet attention. It's a function of the noise of the world. When we're focused on paying attention to social media and TV and gossip and the noise of our own career jockeying or whatever that might be, it's a lot harder to live my life in a compassionate way. It's a lot harder to really listen to the people close to me who need to be heard, but it's also a lot harder to hear the people far away from me who need help. So the noise of the modern world is driving that kind of deficit of empathy that we're talking about. So we work in the book to provide a kind of reframing of that. One of the ways we do that is by looking to the example of Gandhi, who was obviously someone who was as socially engaged as anyone alive in human history, I would say. Mm-hmm. And yet he spent every Monday in silence. He would sometimes see people or even attend meetings, but he wouldn't speak a word. And he said that a seeker after truth needs silence. So that's something we explore in the book. What did he mean that in order to pursue the truth, there needs to be this relationship with silence?
I love that idea, that concept of having to, I guess, quiet or allow silence to cut through all of the opinions and expectations of other people before we can actually get to the truth of the matter.
Absolutely. It's a space of discernment, is what we've really found. Yeah. That when you step into silence, you have, to kind of take away that pressure for the words, as Justin was saying, and pull back from that engagement with all of the verbal and mental stimulus. Then we can discern what's true here. What is the true signal? What needs our attention truly? And what is noise? What is distraction? So we can do better work in the world.
We look at the example of a guy named Cyrus Habib, who moved here when he was a little kid, son of Iranian immigrants. And he went blind when he was 8 years old. And he learned Braille, went to Columbia, Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, Yale Law School. And when he was around 35, became the lieutenant governor of Washington State. And everyone thought this guy was destined to be a US senator or governor or something else in national politics. And he made an announcement that he was taking a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a novice Jesuit priest. So we look at his story and how he describes this work of finding discernment, because he used to have an approach to dealing with politics that was really all about performing. How am I looking? How's this going to appear on Twitter? How's the press release going to appear? Is this going to get picked up by the news? And that was important. He was certainly engaged, but he found that mode of engagement wasn't connected to that discernment this discernment that Leigh's talking about. Am I really tuning into what's true and what's truly going to make a positive difference? So it's something around, this kind of world-centric action we're talking about. It's something about engaging the world, but it's also something about being effective with respect to the people we care about in our own lives. Is the goal performance, or is the goal generating real change?
Mm. That's an interesting and a very important question. I would hope that the answer is real change, but it could be different for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Each person has their own take on it. What I love about what you were both saying here is, if we just take a look at our day and analyze our day from start to finish, at every point, from the time we wake up and we make choices, do we choose to journal and engage in a quiet time and plan our day, or do we go right to the phone? How much stimulus do we let in throughout the day from the news, not only on the TV but the radio and your feeds on social media? We're just constantly bombarded with different messages, sometimes from the same source, conflicting messages. Taking the time just to quiet down and step away from that allows us the space to discern, and I love that term, I love that word, what the truth is or might be, and point us in the right direction.
Absolutely. It seems like a good time to bring silence in a bigger way. Like what we didn't, for example, we didn't create a really strict definition around silence, because silence is so many things to so many people. But what we did do is speak with a lot of devotees of silence and hear their take on it. And so with your permission, I'll bring some of their definitions in.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And then we can get into those practical things too that you're leading us towards. So we met with Gordon Hempton, who's an acoustic ecologist. Which really means he travels the world and has, I think, some 3 or 4 times recording the quietest places on Earth to preserve them and to help us understand what's happening there. So he describes quiet as time undisturbed and silence as the think tank of the soul. Roshi Joan Halifax, who's a pioneering Zen priest and anthropologist and innovator in end-of-life care, describes silence as the place where the egoic self rattles and scratches. But it's also where we learn to listen and where we learn to see. Pir Shabda Khan, who's a Sufi teacher, tells us that silence is not silent at all. It is teeming with life and joy and ecstasy, but it's quiet of thoughts of this self. It's quiet of foolishness.
Beautiful.
And there are more. You want to take us to Judd or somebody? What do you think, Cus?
Yeah, this neuroscientist, Judson Brewer, told us that in the study of silence through fMRI studies of meditators, he's noticed a common denominator of what noisiness in the consciousness feels like and what quiet in the consciousness feels like. And he says that in the study participants, that common denominator is that noise feels like contraction, contractedness in the mind and body. And the feeling of silence is expansion. And we spoke with an Aboriginal Australian academic and carver of traditional tools and cultural critic named Tyson Yunkaporta, who's written a fascinating book called Sand Talk about Indigenous wisdom. And he said that in his Indigenous language, there's no such word for silence. There's no word for it because nature abhors a vacuum, and that true vacuum of no sound or stimulus doesn't exist. And yet he said that there is such a thing as silence in the sense that we're talking about in this book. But he said the way it would be described is the ability to perceive a signal.
That's powerful. I'm brought back to a paragraph of the book when you talk about, I'm probably going to get this wrong, a gentleman went into a soundproof room at one of was it Yale, Harvard? And he said, hey, I'm hearing things, I'm hearing noises. I thought this was soundproof. And I'll let you take it from there as to what
Yeah.
the explanation was, because I think this is really neat.
That's one of our favorites. So that's the modernist composer John Cage, and he stepped into an anechoic chamber at Harvard back in the 50s. And he was really excited about this as a musician. And many musicians really have a profound relationship with not just the sounds that they make and the music they make, but the silence. So a deep appreciator of silence. So he stepped into this anechoic chamber with great high hopes for that silence. And he heard a high pitch and a low pitch. When he was in there, he came out and spoke with the engineer and said, well, hey, wait a minute. I thought it would be silent. What was that? The engineer told him that the high pitch was his, wait, Justin, what did he say is, the low pitch. Yeah, go ahead.
The high pitch was his nervous system in operation, and the low pitch was his blood in circulation.
Yeah.
Which for us is such a powerful statement about the nature of reality. Einstein supposedly said that everything in life is vibration, and modern physics today is showing that everything in the universe, as far as we know, is vibrating, pulsating, resonating at these different frequencies. So can anything be silent? We don't think anything can be silent in the sense of no sound, no vibration. And we embrace that in this book. That's a good thing. But what we mean in this book is not the absence of sound and stimulus or even thought. We mean the absence of noise as the absence of that which is distracting from what we intend to perceive and what we intend to do.
In listing the definitions, the different diverse people that you've talked to, was there one explanation or definition that surprised you or maybe grabbed your attention more than the others?
I'm thinking of Jarvis, or is that what you're thinking? Yeah. I think one of the primary teachers in our book is Jarvis J. Masters. I'll need to tell you a little bit about him before diving in. He's on San Quentin's death row and has been for 30 years. For a crime, the preponderance of evidence shows that he didn't commit. And Justin and I are totally convinced by the evidence we've seen in that regard too. So in his time on death row, he's become a Buddhist master, taken vows with Tibetan Buddhist teachers, Pema Chodron, he calls Mama affectionately. And he has also been an amazing teacher to those around who are interested in his teachings. He brings a lot of quiet to those around him, including us as his friends. So he's one that really helped us make this connection between silence and compassion. And that we were talking about that feeling of despondency and getting more and more away from the ability to empathize. Well, for him, when he taps into silence, then it awakens his compassion for others. He tells a story of being on the yard with other inmates and seeing these tiny scars on their hands and having enough space and quiet in him to be a little bit interested in what was going on with the other people. What were their stories? What were their childhoods? Where did those scars come from? And asking kindly, softly, what happened there? And hearing those stories and just softening in to the silence and to the compassion. For him to connect to silence, it means to get beyond himself and connect to others in a compassionate way. He also tells us a story of when his deepest silence he'd ever known, which was rather recent and in the beginning of the pandemic, when the whole prison was swept with COVID, as you may have heard in the news. It was quite horrific. And he was among the first to get it. His neighbor was also among the first and the very first person or prisoner to die of COVID. So in this completely, disorienting time and this place where he didn't, feel safe and was concerned, he had a lot of internal chatter coming in, right? A lot of worry, and rightfully so. He was given by a physician a bottle of medication, which he was looking over, seeing the side effects and things. And these thoughts were coming in like, this pill's going to kill me. This is, he's very distressed. But right then, a voice came in and said, "It's not about you right now, Jarvis." And what seemed to happen is he connected to his practice of compassion. He suddenly thought instantly of all the people who were suffering in that moment from this very same disease, with all these same unknowns bothering them, worrying them, for their children, for their elders, all the people with pre-existing conditions. He tapped into that, and he suddenly felt so quiet, the deepest silence he'd ever known. It just hushed him. And that's his channel to quiet is compassion. And we learned a lot through that.
That's a powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. I can't even begin to imagine what it would be like in that situation during those trying times. The mental chatter, but the fact that you are stuck in this place with no hope of getting out, with a pandemic that's sweeping through, and there's just nowhere else to go to turn. You've only got to rely on the information being presented to you by, the warden and the doctors there, right? That's got to be a really stressful position to be in. Before we move on, I wanted to touch on something that I think is pretty powerful. And in the book, you describe the economics of why the world has gotten so noisy today. Can you touch on that and tell us a little bit more about that? I think it's a very interesting point.
Yeah. So a lot of times we think about this issue as something personal. It's like, how do I navigate the noise of the world? And one piece of this book, one piece of this argument we make is that this is systemic. This is really a broad issue that has a whole lot to do with the structure of our economy. So we talk in the book about how we tend to use gross domestic product, or GDP, as the measure of the success of a government or the health of an economy. And GDP is useful for many things. It's the headline indicator of, how much industrial production is happening at any given time. But what we point out is that GDP actually goes up with the more noise we're creating, with the buzzes and roars of industrial machinery, or when an app's built-in algorithms figure out that you're in a moment of quiet time in your day, and it swoops in to win your attention, which is good for usage statistics and for company earnings. We look at how GDP goes up when management finds a way to make an employee answer emails late at night, transforming that, supposedly unproductive activity of rest or leisure time into something that's quantifiably a contribution to the monetary economy. So GDP measures, Jeremy Lent, a social theorist, says GDP measures the rate at which a society is transforming nature and human activities like leisure time and play, or time and silence in nature, into the monetary economy, even if that doesn't result in a higher quality of life. So we make this metaphor, like the way we measure GDP, it doesn't count the value of a forest unless we chop down the wood and sell it at Home Depot or find some other monetary use like that. But likewise, in our society today, we don't, using GDP, measure the value of pristine human attention. So when we're just in nature, or when we're just observing a piece of art or playing with our kids, and we're not producing anything because we're in a quiet moment, we don't measure the value of that. So that's baked into the structure of our economy. A lot of people say, well, why is the world so noisy today? Why is it so much like we were just talking about? Why is it so much noisier than it's ever been? So there's a reason for that. And a big part of it is what we measure.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of an alternative measurement that might be more inclusive in what's more positive, the extraction of what's more positive, or the analyzing?
Benefits our well-being?
Sure. It's an important question that economists, particularly environmental economists, have been thinking about now since about the 70s. Some countries, Germany, France, the UK, have all studied new progress indicators. Various US states, including Oregon, Maryland, Utah, have come up either at the government level or nonprofits, have started thinking about the work of how to measure well-being according to a broader set of indicators like a dashboard, for example, of different indicators, or by modifying GDP. So, for example, you take the number of GDP, but you subtract, the effects of crime, for example, or the effects of pollution or traffic time, commute time. One thing, I wrote a different article from the one we just talked about in Harvard Business Review some time ago. And the focus was on how we could turn GDP into something that looks more like a range of different indicators. So a lot of different economic measurements these days, the consumer price index, for example, or the unemployment rate, it's not just one number. There's 4 or 5 different numbers that the government reports. So there's one way to save old-fashioned GDP by having that become G1. And then there's a G2, 3, 4, and leading up to something that looks a little bit more like Bhutan's gross national happiness, which is a reflection of people's self-reported well-being based on survey results over time, which is imperfect, of course. But the question is, are we going to allow a deeply problematic measure to be the only measurement of how we're doing?
Yeah, I'm a capitalist at heart, right? I mean, that's where I grew up in the United States. Obviously, is one of that's our economy. But I've been wondering now for some time have we gotten it wrong at least a little bit? And I think that the consumption, maybe the answer is yes to some degree, and the consumption of natural resources in particular is very disturbing to me. And I really like the way where you're going with some of these new GDP type indicators. And I think it's time, but how do we get to that point where we include or convince others or share with others this idea that maybe we need to switch from the one GDP to a different type of measurement? Because clearly there's going to be some resistance to this type of movement.
Mm-hmm. In a sense that the question goes beyond, whether capitalist or socialist or whatever it might be, because it's not even really about whether we believe in market mechanisms or anything like that. The underlying issue is, what is it that we want to value as a society? What is the goal? Is the goal the maximum production of stuff, or is the goal the maximization of well-being and deep thriving?
Clear from my perspective, it's the latter for sure. I'm wondering how we make that shift and what it would take as a national movement to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And we don't pretend in this book to have the answers to that question. And, it's a bigger question, and we know these questions are really subjective. But one piece that we do keep coming back to is that in the culture that we're living in, there's a real tendency to mistake stress for aliveness. That feeling of full exertion in the sound and stimulus of life is what it means to be alive. Mm-hmm. And one thing we keep coming back to is that various traditions around the world, there's this idea of a kind of well-being that's not so much bound up in what Dr. Judson Brewer explained as those states of contraction, the dopamine rush, the stress of doing, but in states rather of expansion. Aristotle talked of eudaimonia, a kind of happiness grounded in virtue. And Gandhi, who we draw on a lot in this book, talks about when, what we think and what we say and what we do are in line with each other. So one piece of this is that silence is a prerequisite to finding this deeper level of well-being. It's important to be able to get beyond the noise before we can even recognize that such a state of well-being is possible.
Yeah. And it's important for us to not feel overwhelmed by the systemic issues here, like that they are real. We want to say, like, you're not crazy, they are real. Mm-hmm. And we also want to emphasize what one can do personally, but that also isn't the whole of it. So there's a tension we hold here. There's a both and, as we like to say in coaching. It is both something that we can personally do some exploration and changing, and absolutely we've learned firsthand and through the people we've spoken with, make big changes in our lives by thinking about noise and silence a bit differently and really taking that into consideration. And then what we can do collectively, we're really encouraged by and our last chapter is looking at that, or final chapters are looking at that, what we can do in policy and regulation, and how can we shift towards a culture that values silence.
That's great. I'd like to shift now to some of the benefits of spending time in silence and some of the ways that we can do that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, and maybe even bringing in some of the world's religious and spiritual traditions and practices.
Mm-hmm. We'll start with this is, having just said the world's religious traditions, I'll start with small, though. We have a chapter in here called A Healthy Successor to the Smoke Break, mm-hmm. and where I give a little bit of a confession that I used to smoke, or not so much that I used to smoke, but that I loved it. I loved it. I loved the soft kiss on my lips. I loved the sizzle of, as I drew that first drag in, I loved this, watching the swirl of smoke. What I really loved in all that was the quiet I got, the ritualized quiet I got in that break in the midst of crisis work, which is what I was doing, working at crisis shelters and things. So, most of us, many of us quit smoking. And when we did, we tossed out this moment of quiet that we had throughout the day. For me, it might've been like a couple of hours. It was a lot of time. So we ask, what is the healthy successor to the smoke break? There's many reasons to quit, but quitting that quiet wasn't so good for us, perhaps. So we look at these tiny little practices we can bring in our day. What is it like to just take a break and step out into the rays of the sun and just soak that in? It doesn't need to look fancy. It doesn't need to require a lot of, gear or, tools or, a certain type of dogma at all. What is it like to just take note of the transitions from one thing to another, from one meeting to another, from one room to another, and just bring in a little quiet before we even started here, those deep breaths we took together, like those transitional moments, these tiny little things can help bring in some silence into our day-to-day lives. And we really are just inviting the readers to see which of these, ideas spark something in them, and to just start experimenting and see what truly brings them quiet.
And you mentioned, Andy, the religious traditions of the world. And one thing we found is that this is a common element to all the world's religions. Every path has some level of reverence for silence. And part of the reason we wrote this book is this feeling that sometimes it's almost like there's a feeling now that Buddhism and meditation have like a monopoly on these silent practices in the culture today. And it's wonderful. We've both been longtime meditators. And as was mentioned, I spent some time teaching meditation on Capitol Hill in DC when I was working there. And Leigh's brought it into her work in various ways. But we've had 40 years of mindfulness in the culture now, and the world is more distracted than ever. So how do we find a way to bring people back to the remembering of silence within their spiritual practices? Or maybe if a person doesn't have a spiritual practice, this basic human legacy of quiet time as a source of energy and renewal, and that you don't need fancy tools and practices in order to do this. To look at one practice we talk about in the book of just listening. We talked to a former Time magazine White House correspondent who at the end of every stressful day in DC would go sit on her couch and simply listen to the ringing in her own ears. And when she would do that, she would find that ringing would subside. And it was almost like it was a residue of the stress of her day. So the act of simply listening would calm the nervous system. And in our research, we found that scholars at Duke Medical School found that the act of simply listening to silence, there's evidence that it results in the regeneration of neurons in the brain more than listening in any other way.
Amazing. Something that resonated there, and that I love the fact that in your book that you bring up the point that meditation is not the only way to attain this silence. And that, don't get me wrong, we love meditation, we're both practitioners, but it's not for everyone, but that everyone can find a way to find this silence. And I think you actually bring up getting into a flow state is one way to find silence. What I was telling Andy about one of my silent moments was during spelunking, in the middle of the
Yeah.
earth, and just taking that moment to listen or to try to hear the silence, and just finding these moments day to day and simplifying how we think about it. Like, it doesn't have to be a zazen bench hour sit down with incense and everything. As simple as, like you said, stepping outside, enjoying the sun. So
Yeah.
I think on to so much bigger topics here, and just amazing the direction you're going with that.
Thank you. We're interested in what can scale and what will be enduring. And what we found for ourselves is mindfulness was an astonishing teacher in both of our lives, and we loved passing that on. But as our lives changed, we really found different routes to silence. And for me, it's dance. And so a very auditorily loud activity, but so much peace and calm and quiet in the mind. And so that's those flow states you were speaking of. And it's really, we're engaged in some kind of activity in those flow states that are demanding a lot from our attentional capacity there. So we need our focus, and we don't actually have room for self-referential thought, the noisy thoughts of me. So this is what we found when we spoke with neuroscientists, is what's happening here. Why does it feel so quiet when, here I am dancing in this loud room, or, you're skiing down these slopes, or whatever the case may be. And that's true also for moments of awe that we may feel looking out over a beautiful, canyon, or maybe just connecting with some beautiful art, or a sense of like, oh, string theory. Wow. Just awe, you can, so you transcend your small strictures of self, the smaller places, egoic places of self, and then actually also expand to a bigger sense of self that is connected to other things. And we're just very moved by that. So really kind of looking at not just these tiny little moments, but where can we be cultivating more rapturous silence in our lives, appreciating silence as a culture, honoring it, bringing it into our workplaces and our family lives as well. So that we can all have some more space around all this. So, yeah.
Absolutely. We want to be mindful of your time. So I don't necessarily want to dive into this because we're running short on time, but you mentioned, bringing it into the workspace, and you guys talk about this in your book. So for anybody who is interested in how to bring it into your workspace and the benefits there, definitely check out the book. It's really amazing stuff. And this is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, silence and breath work. So we find this is just a very powerful combination. And the whole topic of silence, I think, it's timely, right? So I think you guys hit a moment in time where we need this as a society, as humanity needs this. So I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with us about your book and why silence is so important. Where can folks find out more about, or where to buy your book and find out more about the coaching and consulting you do?
Yeah, you can look us up at Astrea Strategies. That's our consultancy, ASTREA strategies.com. And the book can be found really anywhere, Amazon, independent bookstores, anywhere you buy your books. It's called Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. And we hope it brings you quiet.
Thank you so much, Andy and Casey. I could really feel how this topic resonates with you, and how this is one way of talking about this core element of pristine attention that the two of you are bringing into all of your work and your message with your guests. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Very welcome. Is there anything that we missed in our discussion that you think is important that our listeners need to know?
I would just add the simple fact that we can find so much more clarity and peace in our lives by just paying attention to the silence, by simply appreciating the silence. And all that we shared about the structure of the economy and all these systems and such, the best way ultimately to transform that, while there are many approaches we would recommend, is as a society, as people, to cultivate appreciation for this silence.
Beautiful. Well, we'll end it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's perfectly put. I just say the only other piece to add is that we know how to do this as humans. Like, there is a collective memory here. It's innate in us. It's not hard or tricky, like Justin was saying. It's just a remembering, and that's what we're here to do together.
Beautiful. Thank you both so very much.